fellow wanderers of Middle-earth, gather close as we continue our journey into the heart of Tolkien's greatest tale, following Frodo and his companions as they take their first steps beyond the safety of walls and gates into a world where different laws hold sway and ancient dangers stir in forgotten places. Before we venture forth together, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. And if these chronicles of courage and friendship bring peace to your spirit, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our fellowship of those who find wisdom in the Professor's timeless words. The hours before dawn in Bree Pass with agonizing slowness for hobbits, who have discovered that sleep becomes impossible when every shadow might conceal enemies, and every sound might herald the arrival of forces beyond their understanding. Strider moves through their chamber with the silent efficiency of one accustomed to preparations that mean the difference between life and death. His hands checking weapons and supplies with movements that speak of long experience in situations where careful planning serves as the only protection against overwhelming odds. The decision to trust this enigmatic ranger weighs heavily upon them all, though each expresses their uncertainty in different ways. Sam's protective instincts war with recognition that their circumstances have moved beyond the reach of solutions that loyalty alone can provide. Merry and Pippin exchange glances that reveal their shared awareness that the adventure they once anticipated with excitement has transformed into something far more serious than their sheltered upbringing ever prepared them to face. Frodo carries the heaviest burden of all, the ring's weight in his pocket serving as constant reminder that every choice he makes will determine not just his own fate but the destiny of all free peoples. The magnitude of this responsibility settles around his shoulders like a cloak woven from duty and dread, its fabric growing heavier with each moment that brings them closer to departure from the last outpost of familiar civilization. Strider's explanation of their route reveals immediately how completely their journey has changed from the comfortable plans they once harbored. The roads that should have carried them safely toward their destination must now be avoided as thoroughly as if they led directly into enemy territory. Every path that offers easy travel or reliable shelter has become a trap waiting to spring upon travelers foolish enough to value comfort over concealment. The ranger's knowledge encompasses not just which routes to avoid, but why each seemingly innocent choice could prove fatal to those carrying what they bear. His understanding of their enemies' methods and capabilities transforms the simple act of choosing direction into complex calculations that must account for factors no hobbit mind had ever needed to consider. The pre-dawn departure from Bree proceeds with the careful choreography of a military operation, each movement planned to minimize their visibility, while avoiding patterns that might betray their presence to watchers who possess senses beyond mortal limitation. Strider leads them through back lanes and forgotten paths that skirt the main thoroughfares, his route chosen to ensure that their passage leaves minimal trace for those skilled in reading such signs. The town's familiar walls recede behind them with each step, their solid stones offering final glimpses of the safety they are abandoning in favor of dangers they cannot fully comprehend. The gates that had once seemed like simple barriers between inside and outside now reveal themselves as the boundary between two entirely different worlds, one governed by laws they understand, and another operating according to principles they have yet to learn. The countryside beyond Bree's protection carries different qualities than the managed landscapes they have known throughout their lives. Its wild character speaking of spaces where human influence extends only as far as individual strength can maintain it. Trees grow according to their own purposes, rather than serving the needs of those who might wish to shape them, while paths exist only where countless feet have worn them into existence through necessity rather than planning. Strider's instructions about how they must travel reveal the depth of change required for survival in territory where their enemies hold advantages that conventional wisdom cannot overcome. The habits of a lifetime must be abandoned in favor of practices that feel unnatural to creatures who have always equated visibility with honesty and straightforward movement with virtue. The morning light that illuminates their first steps into the wild carries different qualities than sunshine they have known in sheltered places, its rays revealing a landscape that seems to watch their progress with the patient attention of something that has witnessed the passage of many travelers and remembers the fate that claimed those who lacked sufficient caution or wisdom. The hobbit's footsteps sound unnaturally loud on paths that seem designed to amplify rather than muffle the sounds of passage, while their breathing appears to carry farther than physics should allow in air that feels thinner and less forgiving than the atmosphere they remember from safer territories. Behind them, the last smoke from Bree's chimneys rises into sky that seems somehow less friendly than it appeared when viewed from within walls that offered protection. Ahead stretches territory that promises nothing but the opportunity to test whether their courage and their guide's skill will prove sufficient for the trials that await beyond every horizon. The education that begins with their first mile beyond Bree's influence transforms everything the hobbits thought they understood about the simple act of walking from one place to another. Strider moves through the uneven terrain with an economy of motion that makes no unnecessary sound, his feet finding purchase on stone and root, with the precision of someone who has learned to read the ground beneath him like pages in a familiar book. The hobbit's attempts to mimic his fluid progress result in stumbles and crashes that seem to echo across the countryside with embarrassing volume. Every branch that catches their clothing, every loose stone that shifts beneath their weight, every inadvertent snap of twig underfoot serves as painful reminder of how thoroughly unprepared their comfortable lives have left them for travel through country that offers no accommodation for inexperience. Strider's patience with their clumsiness reveals itself in gentle corrections rather than harsh criticism, his quiet instructions helping them understand which surfaces will support their weight silently, and which will betray their presence to any ears trained to interpret such sounds. He teaches them to place their feet deliberately rather than carelessly, to test each step before committing their full weight to ground that might prove treacherous. The paths he chooses follow logic that becomes apparent only through explanation, his route winding through valleys and along ridgelines according to principles that account for visibility from multiple directions simultaneously. What appears to be inefficient meandering reveals itself as careful navigation, designed to keep them concealed from observation while maintaining progress toward their distant destination. The abandonment of roads proves more difficult for the hobbits than Strider's warnings had prepared them to expect. Generations of their ancestors had traveled between settlements, along established routes that offered reliable footing, predictable distances, and the comfort of knowing that others had passed safely before them. The trackless country through which their guide now leads them provides none of these reassurances. His explanations of why conventional travel has become impossible paint a picture of enemies whose capabilities extend far beyond anything their sheltered upbringing had taught them to imagine. The Black Riders possess senses that can detect the passage of their quarry along any route that sees regular use, while their mounts can cover distances that would exhaust normal horses without showing signs of fatigue. The wilderness becomes both ally and obstacle under Strider's guidance, its broken terrain offering concealment for those who understand how to use it, while presenting barriers that must be overcome through patience and skill rather than brute force. Stream beds provide paths that leave no tracks, while requiring careful navigation to avoid areas where the sound of water might mask approaching danger. Rocky ground offers surfaces that will not record their passage, but demands attention to every step lest loose stones create avalanches of noise that could be heard from considerable distances. Dense thickets provide screens against observation, while forcing them to move at speeds that test their endurance and their ability to maintain silence despite physical discomfort. The Hobbit's understanding of distance and time undergoes radical revision as they discover how much longer it takes to cover ground, when every mile must be earned through careful attention to details that had never required consideration during their previous travels. The straight lines that connect points on maps become meaningless when the actual journey requires constant detours to avoid exposure or dangerous terrain. Strider's knowledge extends beyond simple navigation to encompass understanding of how different times of day affect their visibility and the behavior of potential threats. Morning mists can provide cover for movement across open ground, while also concealing dangers that might otherwise be spotted from safe distances. Afternoon shadows offer concealment, but also create blind spots where enemies might approach undetected. The rhythm of their travel adjusts to accommodate these natural cycles, with periods of rapid movement alternating with times when absolute stillness becomes necessary for survival. The hobbits learn to recognize signals that indicate when they must freeze in place, regardless of their current position or comfort, while understanding that their lives may depend upon their ability to remain motionless until the danger passes. Water sources require special attention, since their enemies will expect travelers to seek out streams and springs for refreshment. Strider teaches them to approach such places with extreme caution, to observe carefully before exposing themselves, and to drink quickly before moving away from areas where ambush becomes possible. The constant vigilance that this new form of travel demands exhausts the hobbits in ways that simple physical exertion never could. Their minds must remain alert to dangers that could approach from any direction, while their bodies struggle to adapt to terrain that offers no mercy for those unprepared to meet its challenges. Food becomes a consideration that requires planning beyond simple preference or availability. Meals must be prepared without fire when smoke might betray their location, while the sense of cooking could carry farther than they dare allow. Strider's trail rations provide sustenance without requiring preparation that might compromise their concealment. Rest periods must be chosen with care, since the places that offer the greatest comfort often present the highest risks for travelers seeking to avoid detection. Rocky outcrops that provide shelter from wind might also create echo chambers that amplify sound, while soft ground that eases tired bodies could preserve evidence of their presence for enemies skilled in tracking. The transformation from comfortable travelers to fugitives fleeing through hostile territory proceeds with relentless efficiency. The first lesson that penetrates the Hobbit's understanding with startling clarity comes when Strider demonstrates how completely their passage through seemingly empty countryside has been recorded in signs that remain invisible to untrained eyes. A bent blade of grass here, a scuff mark on stone there, the particular way moisture clings to disturbed earth, all combine to tell stories that skilled trackers can read as easily as words written on parchment. His patient instruction in recognizing these telltale marks transforms their perception of the landscape around them, from neutral backdrop to active participant in their struggle for survival. Every surface they cross becomes a potential betrayer of their presence, while every step must be considered for the evidence it might leave behind for those who possess the knowledge to interpret such clues. The techniques for minimizing their trail require constant attention to details that had never warranted consideration during their previous travels. Walking on harder surfaces whenever possible, choosing routes that follow natural lines of drainage, where their footprints will be obscured by running water, avoiding areas where their scent might linger in still air or cling to vegetation that could preserve it for days. Strider's demonstration of how to read wind patterns reveals another layer of complexity in their attempts to remain undetected. Air currents carry information about their passage far beyond the visual range of potential pursuers, while changes in direction can transform safe routes into dangerous exposures within the space of minutes. The art of making camp without detection involves skills that challenge everything the hobbits thought they understood about finding rest in unfamiliar territory. The sheltered hollows that would naturally appeal to tired travelers often serve as traps for those seeking to avoid observation. Their protection from weather creating enclosed spaces where sounds echo and scents concentrate in ways that aid rather than hinder pursuit. Strider teaches them to seek positions that offer multiple escape routes while avoiding locations that could become dead ends if discovered by hostile forces. High ground provides visibility but also exposure, while low areas offer concealment at the cost of limiting their awareness of approaching threats. The balance between these competing needs requires judgment that comes only through experience they have yet to acquire. The prohibition against fires extends beyond simple concern about visible smoke to encompass understanding of how light travels in darkness and how the sense of burning wood can carry across distances that would surprise those unaccustomed to wilderness travel. Even the warmth that radiates from recently extinguished coals can be detected by those whose senses have been trained for such purposes. Cold meals become exercises in patience and adaptation as the hobbits learn to find satisfaction in food that provides sustenance, without the comfort they have always associated with proper dining. Water drunk from streams whose temperature shocks rather than refreshes teaches them to value function over pleasure in ways their sheltered upbringing never required. Sleep itself transforms from simple rest into strategic positioning that must account for the possibility of sudden awakening under circumstances where confusion could prove fatal. Strider instructs them in arrangements, that allow for immediate movement while ensuring that essential gear remains within reach. Despite the darkness that might conceal both necessities and threats, the sounds of night in wilderness territory carry meanings that require interpretation by those who would survive until morning. The sudden silence of nocturnal creatures can indicate approaching danger as clearly as any alarm, while the particular calls of birds or beasts might signal the presence of hunters, whose intentions remain hostile to any life they encounter. Strider's ability to distinguish between natural sounds and those that suggest unnatural influences provides constant education in awareness that operates below the level of conscious thought. His body language conveys information about their safety or danger through subtle shifts in posture that the hobbits gradually learn to recognize and respond to without requiring verbal explanation. The tracking skills that allow their enemies to follow their trail work both ways, as Strider demonstrates his own ability to read signs that reveal the passage of other travelers through territory they must cross. The evidence of riders who move by night, the particular disturbances that indicate creatures whose nature differs from ordinary beasts, the traces left by those whose purposes align with forces hostile to all free peoples. His interpretation of these signs provides tactical intelligence that shapes their route and timing in ways that avoid direct confrontation with enemies, whose capabilities far exceed anything the hobbits could hope to match through courage alone. The wisdom that chooses concealment over heroism proves its value through each day that passes without discovery, rather than through dramatic victories that announce their location to every hostile ear within hearing. The hobbits' growing respect for their guide emerges not through single moments of revelation, but through accumulated understanding of the depth and breadth of knowledge required for survival in territory where their enemies hold every advantage save the element of surprise. Each lesson learned reinforces their awareness that their continued existence depends entirely upon skills they do not possess and wisdom they could not acquire through any amount of determination alone. Sam's practical nature adapts most readily to these harsh realities, his experience with outdoor work providing foundation for understanding how careful observation and patient attention to detail can mean the difference between success and failure in endeavors where mistakes carry consequences beyond simple inconvenience. Merry and Pippin struggle more with the constant vigilance that wilderness travel demands, their youth and natural optimism warring with the grim necessity of assuming that danger lurks behind every tree and stone. Yet their intelligence allows them to grasp quickly the principles that govern their new existence, even when applying those principles requires effort that leaves them exhausted. The transformation from protected residents of the Shire into fugitives capable of survival in hostile territory proceeds with the relentless efficiency that necessity imposes upon those who possess no alternative to adaptation. The first indication that their flight from Bree has not freed them from pursuit comes not through any sight or sound that conscious awareness can identify, but rather through a gradual change in the quality of silence that surrounds their passage through increasingly desolate country. The normal background chorus of bird calls and insect activity that marks healthy wilderness begins to fade without obvious cause, leaving behind a listening quiet that presses against their minds with almost physical weight. Strider's growing tension manifests in subtle alterations to his behavior, that the hobbits learned to recognize as warnings more reliable than any spoken alarm. His pauses become more frequent and last longer, his eyes scanning horizons with the methodical attention of someone seeking confirmation of fears he hopes will prove unfounded. His hand rests more often near the hilt of his sword, fingers drumming against leather with rhythms that betray anxiety he works to conceal. The landscape itself seems to participate in the oppressive atmosphere that builds around them like gathering storm clouds. Though no weather threatens from the empty sky above, colors appear muted despite bright sunlight, while familiar shapes take on suggestions of menace that rational thought cannot entirely dismiss. Trees that should provide welcome shade cast shadows that feel too dark and too cold for the season. Sleep becomes increasingly difficult as exhaustion wars with instincts that refuse to accept that rest can be safely taken in territory where invisible watchers might observe their every movement. The hobbits find themselves starting awake at sounds too faint for identification, their hearts racing in response to threats that remain just beyond the edge of perception yet feel utterly real in the darkness. Strider's explanations of their enemies' capabilities paint pictures that make their situation more rather than less comprehensible, though the knowledge brings no comfort to minds already stretched taut by constant vigilance. The Black Rider's ability to sense their quarry across vast distances means that concealment becomes a matter of degree rather than absolute protection, while their relentless nature ensures that every moment of delay increases the likelihood of eventual discovery. The tracks they discover at stream crossings and in muddy hollows tell stories that require no expertise to interpret with growing alarm. Hoofprints that cut too deeply into earth for the weight they should bear. Marks that seem to have been made by horses, whose shoes leave impressions unlike any metal worked by mortal smiths. Evidence of passage by creatures whose very presence drains warmth from the ground they traverse. Strange scents carried on air currents that should bring only the clean smells of growing things, and flowing water instead deliver traces of corruption that make breathing itself an act requiring conscious effort. The particular staleness that speaks of things long dead yet still moving. Odors that belong in sealed tombs, rather than open countryside where life should flourish under sun and rain. The psychological weight of being hunted by forces that operate according to laws beyond mortal understanding begins to affect the hobbits in ways that simple physical exhaustion never could. Conversations become stilted affairs conducted in whispers that somehow seem too loud despite their caution, while laughter disappears entirely from voices that once found joy in the simplest observations about their surroundings. Merry's usual curiosity about new sights and experiences transforms into nervous scanning for threats that might emerge from any direction without warning. Pippin's cheerful chatter dies away as the reality of their situation penetrates defenses built from youth and inexperience with genuine danger. Sam's protective loyalty expresses itself through constant attention to details that might affect their safety rather than the comfort of those he serves. Frodo bears the heaviest burden of awareness that their pursuit stems directly from his inheritance of responsibility he never sought, and consequences he never imagined when accepting Bilbo's legacy. The ring's weight in his pocket serves as constant reminder that every step he takes draws their enemies closer, while simultaneously leading his friends deeper into perils they should never have been asked to face. The nights become exercises in endurance that test their ability to maintain sanity in the face of sounds that seem designed to erode the barriers between rational thought and primitive terror. Calls that might belong to nocturnal birds, yet carry notes of intelligence and malice that no natural creature would possess. Footsteps that approach their hiding places with deliberate stealth, before fading away just as discovery seems certain. Strider's knowledge of their enemy's methods provides tactical information that helps explain the nature of the threat they face, while offering little comfort about their chances of continued evasion. The Black Rider's ability to coordinate their search across vast areas means that escape from one group may simply deliver the fugitives into the territory controlled by another, while their supernatural endurance makes any strategy based on outlasting their pursuit essentially hopeless. The country through which they travel seems to grow more hostile with each mile that passes beneath their feet, as if the very land recognizes the nature of the hunt taking place within its boundaries and chooses sides in conflicts that predate the memory of any mortal race. Springs that should provide clean water carry tastes of metal and decay, while paths that appear to lead toward their destination somehow redirect their steps toward places where exposure becomes unavoidable. The gradual realization that they are not simply being followed, but actively herded toward some predetermined destination adds new dimensions of dread to circumstances already stretched beyond the limits of what hobbit minds were designed to endure. Their route choices, which had seemed to emerge from careful planning and tactical wisdom, begin to feel like responses to pressures applied with subtlety that only becomes apparent in hindsight. The approaching confrontation that all their evasion and concealment has served merely to delay, rather than prevent, begins to feel like inevitability rather than possibility. Strider's preparations take on the character of a general, positioning his forces for a battle he knows must be fought despite overwhelming disadvantages. His calm acceptance of their situation providing the only source of courage available to companions who have moved far beyond the reach of their own resources. The hill that rises from the surrounding moorland announces itself against the horizon, with the stark prominence of something that was never meant to remain hidden, its summit crowned by broken stones that speak of purposes abandoned long before any hobbit had learned to dig the first comfortable hole in green hillsides. Weathertop stands like a monument to ambitions that once reached towards sky and star, but now serves only as a reminder of how completely the works of great civilizations can be reduced to rubble by the patient erosion of centuries. Strider's pace slows as the ancient watchtower comes into view, his eyes studying the distant ruins, with the careful attention of someone reading messages written in collapsed walls and tumbled foundations. The knowledge that fills his weathered features carries weight, that speaks of personal connections to the history embedded in those broken stones, understanding that encompasses not just what the place once was, but what it has become in the long years since its abandonment. The tower's commanding position makes clear why it was chosen by builders who understood the strategic value of elevation in an age when communication across vast distances required physical signals transmitted from height to height. From its summit, watchers could observe movement across leagues of countryside while sending word of what they witnessed to other strongholds, whose own towers caught and relayed such messages toward distant capitals, where decisions of war and peace hung upon the accuracy of reports carried by chains of light. The hobbits' reaction to their first sight of this remnant from the elder days reveals how completely their sheltered upbringing has failed to prepare them for encounters with evidence of the vast sweep of history that preceded their own small place in the world's continuing story. The very concept of stones placed by hands that crumbled to dust before the Shire learned its first planting songs challenges assumptions about the permanence of the familiar world they have always known. Strider's explanation of Weathertop's former glory emerges in fragments delivered between careful observations of the terrain that surrounds their destination, his words painting pictures of the tower as it stood in days when the watch fires burned bright and the horn calls of its guardians carried hope across distances measured in days of hard riding. His knowledge encompasses both the strategic importance the place once held and the particular significance it might possess for their current circumstances. The decision to approach, despite obvious dangers, reflects calculations that balance risks against necessities in ways that demonstrate how completely their situation has moved beyond the reach of safe choices. The exposure that comes with climbing toward the summit must be weighed against the intelligence that might be gathered from such elevation, while the defensive advantages of high ground compete with the visibility that makes concealment impossible. The tower's broken walls offer shelter of sorts, while also creating potential traps for those who might find themselves cornered within spaces that provide no alternative exits when enemies approach from below. Strider's assessment of these competing factors reveals experience with tactical situations, where every advantage carries corresponding vulnerabilities that must be considered before committing to courses of action that cannot easily be reversed. The surrounding landscape shows signs of ancient cultivation that speak of times when the hills supported more than just military installations, evidence of gardens and farmsteads that once flourished under the protection of the watchtower's vigilant guardians. The traces of field boundaries and foundation stones scattered across the lower slopes create ghostly suggestions of communities that trusted in the strength of the tower's watch to preserve their peaceful pursuits from the chaos that threatened beyond the horizon. The path that leads toward the summit follows routes worn by feet that climbed these slopes during centuries when such journeys formed part of daily routine rather than desperate expedients undertaken by fugitives, seeking temporary advantage over relentless pursuers. The stones that pave certain sections speak of engineering skills that transformed treacherous ascents into manageable grades. Though time and weather have reduced much of this careful work to scattered rubble that creates new hazards for the unwary. Wildlife in the immediate vicinity of the tower shows the same unnatural absence that has marked their journey through territory claimed by forces hostile to natural life. The normal populations of birds and small creatures seemingly driven away by influences that operate below the threshold of ordinary perception, yet create environments too uncomfortable for creatures whose instincts warn them away from places where death walks freely. Strider's preparations for their ascent involve more than simple planning for a difficult climb. His attention to details that might seem insignificant, revealing awareness of factors that could determine their survival should their visit to the summit attract the wrong kind of attention. The positioning of their few supplies, the preparation of weapons that might be needed quickly, the identification of escape routes that could be followed even in darkness or under conditions where clear thinking becomes impossible. The afternoon light that illuminates their approach to the base of the hill carries the particular quality that makes distant objects appear closer than they truly are, while simultaneously revealing details that would remain hidden under different conditions. This clarity of vision extends to the broken stones of the tower itself, where shadows between the ruins create patterns that suggest chambers and passages that might still offer shelter to those desperate enough to seek it. The hobbits' growing apprehension as they begin their climb stems not from the physical challenge of the ascent, but from awareness that each step carries them further, from the possibility of concealment and closer to exposure that will make them visible to any eyes scanning the surrounding country for signs of the quarry they have pursued so relentlessly across miles of increasingly hostile territory. The summit calls to them with the promise of temporary respite and strategic advantage, yet something in the quality of the air that moves around the tower's broken walls suggests that safety and exposure might prove to be the same thing, when viewed from perspectives that encompassed more than the immediate tactical situation. The debate that unfolds at the base of Weathertop reveals the depth of tactical knowledge that guides Strider's every decision. His reluctance to expose them on the tower's broken heights warring with recognition that their current position offers no long-term advantages against enemies, whose capabilities extend far beyond anything conventional wisdom could anticipate. The high ground calls with promises of visibility and defensive position, yet that same elevation would transform them from hidden fugitives into visible targets for any eyes scanning the surrounding moorland. His assessment of their alternatives paints a grim picture of choices that offer different forms of risk rather than genuine safety. The surrounding country providing little in the way of natural fortification that could serve their needs through the dangerous hours of darkness ahead. The broken terrain that has helped conceal their approach also limits their options for continued flight, while their enemy's persistence makes clear that evasion alone cannot serve as strategy for indefinite survival. The ascent begins through brambles and loose stone that seem designed to announce their presence to any ears trained to interpret the sounds of struggle against hostile terrain. Each step upward requires careful placement to avoid sending cascades of rubble tumbling down slopes that would amplify such noise across distances they cannot afford to span. Thorns catch at their clothing with persistence that suggests malevolent intelligence, while hidden roots and unstable rocks threaten to turn each footfall into potential disaster. The hobbits' lack of experience with serious climbing becomes apparent immediately as they struggle against gradients that test both physical capability and mental resolve. Their hands, softened by years of comfortable indoor work, find little purchase on stone that crumbles beneath their grip, while their legs protest against exertions that require types of strength their daily routines never developed. Sam's determination drives him upward despite obvious discomfort, while Merry and Pippin discover reserves of endurance they had not known they possessed. Strider's assistance comes in the form of guidance that transforms impossible obstacles into merely difficult challenges, his knowledge of climbing techniques allowing him to identify routes that minimize both effort and exposure while maintaining steady progress toward their destination. His rope appears when gaps in the broken stone require aid that muscle alone cannot provide, while his patient instruction helps them understand how to distribute their weight across surfaces that might otherwise prove unable to support them. The evidence of previous visitors becomes apparent well before they reach the summit, signs of recent presence that speak of others who sought the tower's strategic advantages for purposes that may or may not align with their own. Ashes scattered among the ruins suggest fires that burned within memory, while disturbed areas in the accumulated debris indicate systematic searching by those who possessed specific objectives rather than casual curiosity about ancient stonework. The particular character of these traces raises questions that Strider's examination cannot fully answer, though his growing tension suggests recognition of patterns that carry implications beyond simple confirmation that they are not the first to seek shelter among Weathertop's broken walls. The careful arrangement of certain stones speaks of efforts to create windbreaks or observation posts, while cleared areas suggest campsites chosen with knowledge of the tower's layout and defensive capabilities. Fragments of gear left behind by these previous occupants tell stories that require interpretation beyond the Hobbit's experience to understand fully, though the quality of certain items suggests visitors whose resources and purposes differed significantly from their own desperate flight. Strider's handling of these artifacts reveals both curiosity and caution. His examination, thorough yet respectful of possibilities that such objects might carry messages intended for eyes other than his own. The summit itself proves to be larger than appeared possible when viewed from below, its broken walls creating a complex arrangement of chambers and passages that offer multiple options for shelter, while maintaining visibility across the surrounding countryside. The strategic value that drew the tower's original builders becomes immediately apparent from this elevation. The view encompassing vast stretches of territory, where movement would be impossible to conceal from watchful eyes positioned at such height. The defensive advantages of their position emerge through Strider's explanation of how the ruins could be utilized to their benefit, should circumstances require them to make a stand against pursuit that has followed them to this ancient refuge. The fallen stones provide both cover and potential weapons, while the complex layout creates opportunities for tactical movement that might confuse enemies unfamiliar with the site's particular geography. Yet these same advantages carry corresponding vulnerabilities that become apparent through careful examination of their surroundings. The elevation that grants them superior observation, also making them visible to any watchers positioned elsewhere across the moorland. The winds that sweep across the exposed summit carry sounds farther than they would travel in more sheltered locations, while the lack of easy escape routes means that discovery here could transform their refuge into a trap from which extraction might prove impossible. The decision to remain despite these risks reflects calculations that weigh immediate tactical advantages against longer-term strategic considerations. Their need for rest and the intelligence that might be gathered from such elevation, outweighing the exposure that comes with occupying position so prominently visible across miles of surrounding country. As evening approaches and shadows begin to gather among the broken walls, the summit of Weathertop takes on the character of temporary sanctuary that feels both safer and more dangerous than anything they have experienced since leaving the comfortable certainties of breeze walls behind them. The ancient stones seem to settle around them like protective embrace, yet something in the quality of approaching darkness suggests that night will bring challenges that daylight has only postponed rather than eliminated entirely. The comfort that draws the hobbits toward their fatal mistake emerges from needs deeper than simple physical warmth. Their exhausted spirits craving the familiar consolation that fire has provided throughout every season of their sheltered lives. The broken walls of Weathertop offer protection from the wind that cuts across the exposed summit with increasing sharpness as evening settles over the moorland. Yet this natural windbreak creates the illusion of safety that proves more dangerous than any physical threat they have yet encountered. Sam's practical nature focuses on the immediate discomfort of their companions, rather than the broader implications of solutions that might address such needs. His hands moving automatically toward the task of gathering the scattered wood that lies abundant among the ruins. The dry timber that previous visitors left behind seems to offer itself for exactly such purposes, its availability suggesting that others have made similar choices, without suffering consequences that would have scattered warnings among the stones. Merry and Pippin's enthusiasm for the project stems from associations between firelight and fellowship that have colored every pleasant evening of their previous existence. Their memories filled with images of warmth and conversation shared around hearths that represented the heart of domestic contentment. The prospect of recreating even pale shadows of such comfort in their current circumstances appeals to spirits worn thin by days of constant vigilance and primitive conditions. The kindling catches with eager flames that seem to celebrate their liberation from the darkness, where they have waited through seasons of abandonment, the fire spreading through the carefully arranged fuel. With the enthusiasm of something that has long been denied its proper function, light begins to dance across the broken walls with patterns that transform the ancient stones into something approaching the welcoming chambers their builders originally intended. The warmth that radiates from their small blaze carries with it the psychological comfort that penetrates deeper than mere physical sensation, reaching places in their spirits that have grown cold during days of travel, through territory where every natural impulse toward normal living had to be suppressed in favor of survival. For precious moments, the fire creates an island of civilization within the vast wilderness that has claimed dominion over so much of the world beyond the Shire's protected borders. The food that they warm over the flames tastes better than anything they have consumed since leaving Bree's hospitality behind. The simple process of heating their provisions, transforming basic sustenance into something approaching the satisfying meals that once marked the comfortable rhythm of their days. The tea that Sam brews in his small pot carries flavors that speak of home and safety rather than mere liquid consumed for practical necessity. The conversation that begins to flow around their fire feels like the first genuine relaxation they have experienced since accepting the burden of their quest. Voices losing the careful whispers that have characterized their exchanges during the dangerous days of flight. Laughter emerges tentatively at first, then with increasing freedom as the warmth and light work their ancient magic on spirits that have forgotten what it feels like to exist without constant fear. The psychological transformation that accompanies these physical comforts proves far more dangerous than the mere visibility their fire creates across the surrounding landscape. Their growing sense of security blinding them to realities that should have remained paramount in every decision they made. The circle of light that surrounds them seems to expand the boundaries of safety, rather than marking them as targets for any hostile eyes that might scan the darkness beyond. Strider's return from his reconnaissance of the surrounding area brings him face to face with a scene that transforms his controlled concern into something approaching horror, his eyes taking in the cheerful fire and the relaxed demeanor of his companions, with the stunned recognition of someone witnessing disaster that has already moved beyond any possibility of prevention. The flames that seem so welcoming to hobbit eyes appear to his experienced vision as beacon announcing their location to every enemy. Within miles of Weathertop's prominent position, his approach to their fire carries the careful movements of someone who has suddenly found himself standing in territory where death might arrive from any direction without warning. His voice when he speaks carrying tones that cut through their comfortable conversation with the sharp authority of absolute command. The words that emerge from his lips destroy their brief illusion of safety as efficiently as water poured upon their cheerful flames. The explanation that follows his initial shock paints their situation in terms that make clear how completely their moment of comfort has transformed into invitation for disaster that no amount of preparation can now prevent. The light that has seemed so pleasant to their eyes has been visible for hours to any watchers. Positioned across the vast expanse of moorland that surrounds Weathertop, while the smoke that rose from their fire carried messages that could be read by those whose senses operate according to principles beyond normal understanding. The realization that they have betrayed their own vocation strikes each hobbit with the particular horror that comes from understanding how completely good intentions can lead to consequences beyond any reasonable proportion to the original mistake. Their desire for simple comfort has created exposure that transforms their strategic position from advantage into trap, while their moment of fellowship has purchased disaster that no amount of regret can now prevent. Strider's preparations for what must now come proceed with the grim efficiency of someone whose experience encompasses situations where survival depends upon accepting rather than lamenting the reality of circumstances that cannot be changed. His hands move among their supplies with movements that speak of protocols developed through encounters with similar crises, each action designed to maximize their chances during trials that have moved beyond the realm of possibility into inevitable fact. The fire that had seemed to create sanctuary now appears as betrayer that has sold their safety for the brief warmth it provided, its dancing flames marking time until enemies drawn by its signal can complete their approach to the position it has revealed with such deadly accuracy. The darkness that gathers around Weathertop's summit carries a quality that goes beyond mere absence of light, pressing inward against their small circle of firelight with the weight of something that possesses intelligence and malevolent purpose. The night air grows thick with presence that makes breathing difficult, despite the open sky above, while temperatures drop with suddenness that speaks of influences operating outside the normal patterns of weather and season. The first indication of approaching doom comes not through sight or conventional sound, but through a change in the very texture of reality around them, as if the fundamental laws that govern the behavior of matter and energy have begun to warp under pressure from forces that exist partially outside the normal boundaries of creation. The flames of their fire begin to behave strangely, flickering in patterns that follow no natural rhythm, while casting shadows that seem to move independently of the objects that should create them. Strider's sword emerges from its sheath, with the whisper of steel that has tasted blood in defense of causes greater than personal survival. The blade catching firelight along edges that have been honed for purposes that extend far beyond simple combat against ordinary enemies. His stance shifts into configurations that speak of training received in schools where instruction encompassed threats that most warriors never imagine facing during entire careers devoted to conventional warfare. The horses that carry their enemies up the slopes of Weathertop announce their approach through hoofbeats that strike stone with sounds like hammer blows against anvils, forged in realms where different acoustics apply, each step resonating through the ancient foundations with vibrations that seem to shake more than mere rock and mortar. The rhythm of their ascent carries inexorable certainty that speaks of pursuit that will not be deterred by any obstacle short of absolute destruction. Frodo's awareness of the ring's presence intensifies beyond anything he has experienced since inheriting his terrible burden. The golden circle seeming to pulse against his consciousness, with demands that grow stronger with each moment, that brings their enemies closer to the summit. The metal that once felt like simple jewelry now burns against his flesh with cold fire that penetrates through clothing and skin to reach places where physical sensation becomes indistinguishable from spiritual agony. The compulsion that begins to build within his mind operates below the level of conscious thought. Instincts older than reason whispering that safety lies in surrender to powers that promise protection in exchange for submission to wills that operate according to logic beyond mortal comprehension. The ring calls to him with voices that speak in languages he has never learned, yet somehow understands. Their words painting pictures of escape from dangers that threaten to overwhelm his fragile mortality. Sam's loyalty manifests in desperate attempts to position himself between his master and threats that remain invisible, yet feel more real than the broken stones beneath their feet. His hands gripping weapons for which his gardening experience provides no preparation, while his determination supplies courage that training alone could never provide. The mathematical impossibility of their situation becomes irrelevant when measured against bonds that transcend any reasonable calculation of survival odds. The Black Riders themselves materialize from darkness that seems to thicken around their forms like fog condensing into nightmare-given substance, their shapes becoming visible not through any light that reveals them, but through the particular quality of shadow that surrounds beings who exist in permanent twilight between life and death. 9 figures that move with coordination that speaks of shared purpose transcending individual identity. Their unity more complete than any army could achieve through mere discipline. The terror that radiates from their presence strikes the hobbits with force that bypasses rational thought, to attack directly the primitive centers of consciousness that govern the most basic survival responses, paralyzing muscles while accelerating heartbeats beyond sustainable rhythms. Fear becomes a living thing that crawls beneath their skin, while whispering suggestions of surrender that would end the agony of resistance against forces too vast for mortal minds to encompass. Frodo's hand moves toward the ring with movements that feel both involuntary and inevitable, his fingers closing around metal that seems to reach out to meet his touch, while promising relief from the crushing weight of terror that threatens to stop his heart entirely. The moment of contact brings awareness that stretches beyond the boundaries of his individual consciousness, revealing perspectives that encompass realms where different rules apply to existence itself. The world that becomes visible when the ring slips onto his finger exists in shades of grey and silver that drain color from everything, while revealing details that remain hidden from normal sight, the broken walls of Weathertop becoming translucent barriers that cannot conceal the true forms of their enemies. The Black Riders stand revealed as creatures of shadow and ancient malice whose substance consists of hatred, given form through arts that violate the fundamental principles governing life and death. The Witch King's true nature emerges from concealment like revelation delivered through channels that bypass ordinary perception, his presence filling awareness with understanding of power that has been shaped through centuries of existence, devoted entirely to purposes that serve destruction rather than creation. The crown that rests upon his invisible brow carries weight that transcends mere symbol, its authority extending across realms, where the boundaries between spiritual and physical become meaningless distinctions. Strider's attack upon the Black Riders proceeds with techniques that demonstrate training in methods of combat that few living warriors have been taught. His blade moving through patterns designed to affect enemies whose substance exists partially outside the reach of ordinary weapons. Fire becomes his ally as he drives burning brands toward forms that recoil from flames while seeking to engulf his charges in darkness that would drag them beyond the reach of any rescue. The battle that unfolds around their extinguished fire pit transforms the ancient summit into an arena where forces representing opposing principles of existence clash with intensity that threatens to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. The weapon that strikes from the heart of shadow carries within its cursed steel the accumulated malice of ages, spent in service to purposes that seek the complete corruption of everything they touch. Its blade forged in fires that burn without light in foundries, where the very concept of healing has been systematically eliminated from every process of creation. The wound it creates transcends mere physical damage to become violation of the fundamental principles that govern the relationship between body and spirit in creatures meant to dwell wholly within the boundaries of mortal existence. Frodo's awareness of the strike comes not through pain, but through sudden understanding that something essential within him has been severed with surgical precision, connections between consciousness and flesh, disrupted in ways that no conventional injury could accomplish. The blade penetrates through clothing and skin to reach depths where physical sensation becomes indistinguishable from spiritual agony. Its touch introducing influences that begin immediately to spread through systems designed for life, rather than the twilight existence that serves as compromise between death and continuation. The cold that radiates outward from the point of contact carries qualities that have nothing to do with temperature as normally understood, instead representing the absence of warmth in ways that encompassed far more than simple heat lost to surrounding air. This supernatural chill penetrates through muscle and bone to reach places where the spark of life burns brightest, seeking to extinguish not just bodily function, but the essential vitality that animates consciousness itself. Strider's reaction to witnessing the strike reveals knowledge that encompasses both the specific nature of the weapon employed and the particular doom it delivers to those unfortunate enough to receive its touch. His face shows understanding of processes that have begun within Frodo's body, that will proceed according to timelines measured not in days but in hours. Corruption that spreads with the relentless efficiency of poison, designed to transform rather than simply destroy its victims. The Morgul Blade's purpose extends beyond mere murder, to encompass transformation that would remake its victim into something that serves the will of those who forged it, the wound acting as conduit through which influences hostile to free will can enter and begin their work of systematic conversion. The knife that inflicted the injury disappears into mist that carries the acrid scent of substances that have no place in the clean air of Middle-earth, its substance returning to whatever realm spawned its creation. Sam's horror at seeing his master struck down manifests in protective fury that drives him toward enemies, whose nature places them beyond the reach of any weapon he carries. His loyalty demanding action despite the mathematical impossibility of affecting creatures who exist primarily in realms where courage alone provides insufficient foundation for successful intervention. His calls to Frodo carry desperation that penetrates through the growing haze that clouds wounded consciousness. The visible effects of the Morgul Blade's work begin almost immediately as color drains from Frodo's features, with the speed of ink dissolving in water, his flesh taking on the translucent quality that speaks of barriers between worlds becoming dangerously thin. His breathing grows shallow, while his pulse adopts rhythms that suggest systemic changes, proceeding according to patterns that have nothing to do with normal healing or conventional medicine. Merry and Pippin's attempts to provide assistance reveal the helplessness that overtakes even the most determined efforts when confronted with injuries that operate according to principles outside the reach of any knowledge their peaceful upbringing provided. Their hands hover uselessly over their wounded friend, while their minds struggle to process evidence that the world contains threats capable of inflicting damage that conventional understanding cannot encompass or address. The Black Riders' retreat following their successful strike carries the satisfaction of hunters who have accomplished their primary objective, their withdrawal proceeding with the unhurried confidence of those who understand that time now works in their favor rather than against it. The wound they have inflicted will complete their work more efficiently than any direct assault, transforming their quarry into willing servant through processes that cannot be prevented by any mortal power. Strider's knowledge of the specific doom that now threatens Frodo emerges through explanations that balance honesty about their situation against the need to maintain hope sufficient to motivate continued action. Despite overwhelming disadvantages, the Morgul Blade's poison works according to schedules that allow for intervention by those who possess the necessary knowledge and resources, yet the window for effective treatment narrows with each passing moment. The urgency that drives their immediate preparations for departure stems from understanding that geography now matters in ways that transcend simple distances measured in miles. Their destination determined not by tactical considerations, but by the location of aid that might prove capable of addressing injuries that exist as much in spiritual realms as physical ones. Rivendell's healing traditions encompass knowledge that ordinary medicine cannot provide, yet reaching such sanctuary requires covering ground at speeds that might prove impossible given their wounded companions' rapidly deteriorating condition. Frodo's attempts to minimize the severity of his injury reflect both genuine uncertainty about the extent of damage he has sustained, and natural reluctance to accept that his wound represents transformation rather than simple trauma that will heal through rest and conventional treatment. The particular numbness that spreads outward from the point of contact creates illusions of improvement that disguise the systematic corruption proceeding beneath the surface of awareness. The packs that must be gathered and organized for immediate departure contain supplies selected not for comfort during extended travel, but for materials that might prove essential in maintaining life during flight toward uncertain salvation. Strider's medical knowledge encompasses treatments that can slow rather than stop the poison's advance, buying precious time at costs that include discomfort and risks that healthy companions would never be asked to accept. The descent from Weathertop's exposed summit proceeds under cover of darkness that now serves as ally rather than threat, concealment that protects their movement, while the spreading weakness in Frodo's limbs makes speed increasingly difficult to maintain. Despite the desperate urgency that drives every decision they make, the descent from Weathertop proceeds with the controlled desperation of those who understand that every moment of delay increases the likelihood that their wounded companion will slip beyond the reach of any aid that mortal hands can provide, yet who also recognize that haste leading to injury or discovery could prove equally fatal to their diminishing chances of reaching sanctuary. Strider's route selection balances speed against concealment, in calculations that must account for terrain features invisible in darkness, while avoiding exposure that might attract renewed attention from enemies, whose patience exceeds their own by orders of magnitude. Frodo's weight becomes a factor that transforms simple movement into complex engineering, as his ability to support himself diminishes with each step they take away from the cursed summit. Sam's strength proves adequate for brief periods of assistance, yet the distances they must cover require distribution of effort among all four of his companions, in arrangements that slow their progress while ensuring that exhaustion does not claim additional victims. Among those still capable of independent action, the improvised stretcher that Strider constructs from materials salvaged from their supplies represents compromise between conflicting demands that have no perfect solution. Its design prioritizing functionality over comfort, while remaining light enough for transport across terrain that offers few accommodations for travelers burdened with injured companions. The cloak that serves as primary support must bear weight, while allowing for adjustments that account for changing conditions, and the need for rapid movement when circumstances demand such speed. The path that leads away from Weathertop follows routes that exist more in Strider's memory than in any visible trace upon the ground, his navigation proceeding through reference to landmarks that remain invisible to his companions, while avoiding areas where their passage might leave evidence, readable by those whose tracking skills encompass abilities beyond normal mortal perception. Each choice of direction reflects calculations that weigh immediate tactical needs against longer-term strategic requirements. Sam's determination manifests in willingness to accept burdens that exceed his physical capabilities by margins that should render such efforts impossible, his loyalty providing strength that training alone could never supply, while his practical experience with heavy loads allows him to distribute weight in ways that maximize efficiency despite suboptimal conditions. His breathing grows labored, yet never falters, as he matches pace with companions whose longer strides should leave him struggling to maintain contact. Merry and Pippin's youth serves them well during hours that stretch their resilience in ways their comfortable upbringing never prepared them to face, their bodies adapting to demands that would have seemed impossible. During the peaceful days when their greatest physical challenges involved lengthy walks between neighboring villages for social visits, their hands develop blisters while their legs protest against continued exertion. Yet their commitment never wavers, despite growing awareness of the mathematical improbability of their success. The sounds that pursue them through the darkness carry qualities that suggest hunters whose persistence operates according to principles that make no accommodation for concepts like fatigue or the need for rest. Mechanical precision that contrasts sharply with the ragged breathing and stumbling steps that mark their own passage through territory that seems designed to amplify rather than muffle evidence of their desperate flight. Distance provides temporary respite rather than genuine safety from enemies whose capabilities transcend normal limitations. Frodo's consciousness drifts in and out of awareness that encompasses both his immediate surroundings and visions of places that exist beyond the normal boundaries of waking perception, his wounded spirit touching realms where the influence of the Morgul blade creates connections to powers that seek to claim him for purposes that serve corruption rather than healing. His words, when they come, carry meanings that his companions cannot fully interpret yet recognize as evidence of struggles taking place on battlefields they cannot see. The corruption that spreads through his system proceeds according to timelines that Strider's medical knowledge can track, but not significantly alter. Each landmark they pass, measuring progress, not just across physical distance, but through stages of transformation that will reach completion, regardless of whether they achieve their destination. The treatments he applies during brief rest stops slow, rather than stop, the poison's advance, buying precious hours at costs that include discomfort and risks to systems already strained beyond normal tolerances. Water sources require careful approach, since their enemies will anticipate the need for such necessities, while possessing advantages that make traditional ambush sites particularly dangerous for travelers whose condition prevents rapid response to sudden threats. Streams that should provide relief from thirst instead become tactical challenges that must be navigated with attention to factors that extend far beyond simple access to liquid refreshment. The landscape through which they travel seems to respond to the supernatural forces that hunt them, by becoming progressively more hostile to their passage. Paths that existed during their approach to Weathertop disappearing beneath undergrowth that springs up overnight, while familiar landmarks shift position in ways that defy rational explanation. The very ground beneath their feet appears to resist their efforts, while providing easy passage for those whose purposes align with the spreading corruption that seeps outward from sources they cannot identify. Food becomes secondary consideration when measured against the urgency that drives every decision they make. Yet the energy required for sustained effort demands fuel that their bodies cannot manufacture from determination alone. The cold provisions they consume during hurried meals provide sustenance without satisfaction, while reminding them of comforts that belong to circumstances they may never experience again. Sleep transforms from biological necessity into luxury they cannot afford. Rest periods measured in minutes rather than hours, while remaining constantly alert for signs that their pursuers have narrowed the distance separating hunter from quarry. The exhaustion that accumulates despite these brief respites threatens to undermine their coordination at precisely the moments when such precision becomes most essential for survival. The weight of carrying their wounded friend distributes among them according to capabilities that shift as strength wanes, and determination provides increasingly inadequate substitute for physical resources that cannot be replenished under their current circumstances. The knowledge that guides Strider's hands as he tends to Frodo's wound encompasses traditions that stretch back through centuries of warfare against enemies whose weapons inflict damage beyond the reach of conventional medicine. His fingers move with the practiced certainty of someone who has treated similar injuries under circumstances where failure meant not just death, but transformation into something that serves the purposes of those who forged the cursed blade. The techniques he employs represent accumulated wisdom passed down through generations of rangers, who learned their healing arts in conflicts where such skills often determined the difference between salvation and corruption. The Athilus that emerges from his carefully guarded supplies carries within its dried leaves properties that extend far beyond the simple medicinal herbs found in any village healer's collection. This kingsfoil possesses virtues that work specifically against the particular corruptions, introduced by weapons forged in realms where the normal relationship between mat, and spirit has been deliberately perverted. The plant's ability to slow supernatural poisons makes it invaluable to those who face enemies operating outside the boundaries of natural law. His preparation of the healing draught proceeds with the methodical care of someone who understands that precise measurements and timing can mean the difference between effective treatment and useless gesture when dealing with injuries that exist as much in spiritual realms as physical ones. The water he uses must be drawn from sources uncorrupted by the influences that seep outward from places where darkness has gained foothold. His small pot heats over flames that burn without smoke to avoid attracting attention from watchers whose senses operate beyond normal limitations. The steam that rises from the brewing Athilus carries scents that speak of growing things and clean earth. These aromas provide immediate relief to lungs that have been struggling against the oppressive atmosphere surrounding their wounded companion. The fragrance itself possesses healing properties that work through channels other than simple ingestion. The very act of breathing such purified air begins the process of resistance against corruption that seeks to claim Frodo's spirit along with his flesh. Strider's knowledge extends beyond the preparation of remedies to encompass understanding of how supernatural wounds must be treated differently from injuries inflicted by conventional weapons. The Morgul blade's poison spreads through pathways that connect physical sensation to spiritual essence. Treatment must address both aspects simultaneously or risk leaving channels open through which corruption can continue its advance despite apparent improvement in visible symptoms. The application of the Athilus-infused water requires techniques that transform simple washing into ritual that engages forces beyond mere physical cleansing. His movements follow patterns that have been refined through experience with similar cases. Each gesture serves specific purposes in the complex process of creating barriers between corrupted flesh and the healthy tissue that still resists the blade's influence. The water itself seems to respond to his touch. By concentrating its healing properties where they are most desperately needed. Frodo's reaction to the treatment reveals both the extent of damage already inflicted and the plant's ability to slow its advance through systems designed for life rather than the twilight existence that represents compromise between death and corruption. Color begins to return to features that had taken on the translucent quality, marking barriers between worlds growing dangerously thin. His breathing deepens while adopting rhythms closer to normal patterns. The temporary improvement that follows application of the Athilus provides relief that extends beyond mere physical sensation to encompass restoration of hope among companions who had begun to fear that their friend was slipping beyond the reach of any aid they could provide. Sam's face shows the particular gratitude of someone whose loyalty has been tested by watching suffering he could not alleviate through any action within his power to perform. Yet Strider's expression carries understanding that this respite represents delay rather than cure. The Athilus can slow the Morgul Blade's work without stopping it entirely. His medical knowledge encompasses clear awareness of the timeline they face, and the ultimate destination where true healing might be found. The treatment he provides serves as bridge that must span the distance between their current position and sanctuaries where deeper wisdom can address corruption that exceeds his field capabilities. The additional preparations he makes, while the Athilus continues its work, involve techniques that support the plant's primary effects through complementary approaches. Certain herbs applied directly to the wound create barriers that resist supernatural influence. Others, when consumed as tea, strengthen natural defenses against spiritual contamination. His knowledge of such combinations represents expertise gained through encounters with similar cases, where success required every available advantage. The bandages he applies serve purposes beyond simple protection of injured flesh. The cloth itself has been treated with substances that maintain the Athelus's influence, even when direct application becomes impractical during continued travel. The patterns in which he wraps these coverings follow traditions that engage symbolic as well as practical aspects of the healing process. Each layer adds two protections that must hold against influences actively seeking to overwhelm them. Time constraints force him to work more quickly than ideal circumstances would require. The pursuit that follows them allows only brief periods for such intensive treatment. His movements reflect awareness that thoroughness must be balanced against the need to resume flight before their enemies narrow the distance that separates hunter from quarry. The healing he provides must be sufficient to sustain his patient through continued hardship, rather than complete enough to eliminate all traces of the wound. The knowledge that guides his treatment extends to understanding of how different individuals respond to supernatural injuries, based on factors that include not just physical constitution, but spiritual resilience, and the particular nature of their connection to forces that operate beyond normal mortal perception. Frodo's burden as ring-bearer creates complications that make his case unique among those Strider has previously treated. The equipment he packs away after completing his immediate intervention includes supplies reserved for follow-up treatments that will be required during their continued journey. The Athilus represents only the most dramatic of the remedies he carries. His knowledge encompasses dozens of supporting therapies, that must be applied according to schedules determined by the poison's advance, rather than conventional medical timing. The improvement in Frodo's condition allows them to resume travel with renewed hope. The pace they can maintain increases significantly, from the desperate crawl that had marked their initial flight from Weathertop's cursed summit. The tracks that Strider discovers during their brief rest beside a hidden stream tell stories that require no expertise to interpret with growing alarm. The hoofprints cut deep into mud that should barely record the passage of normal horses. Their edges remain sharp despite hours of exposure to wind, and whether that should have softened such impressions into illegibility. The spacing between steps speaks of creatures whose stride covers ground with efficiency that no mortal mount could sustain. Across the distances, their enemies have already traveled. The particular quality of these marks reveals details that transform simple evidence of pursuit into confirmation of supernatural persistence that operates according to principles beyond normal endurance. Earth that bears such impressions shows discoloration around each print. The soil itself appears to recoil from contact with hooves, whose substance carries influences hostile to natural growth. Grass that grows near these tracks displays the withered appearance of vegetation struggling against contamination that seeps upward from depths where wholesome things cannot survive. Strider's examination of the trail proceeds with methodical attention to factors that allow him to calculate not just the direction of their enemy's approach, but the timeline that governs the narrowing gap between hunter and quarry. His measurements of stride, length, and depth provide data that translates into estimates of speed and distance that paint increasingly grim pictures of their chances for maintaining separation across terrain that offers few advantages to those fleeing on foot. The landscape through which they travel shows signs of the same supernatural influence that marks their enemy's passage. Trees that should flourish in the rich soil of river valleys display stunted growth, and premature yellowing of leaves that speak of contamination affecting the very foundations of natural health. Streams that once ran clear now carry traces of metallic taste that makes drinking an act requiring conscious effort to overcome instinctive revulsion. Wildlife continues its systematic abandonment of territory claimed by forces that create environments hostile to creatures whose survival depends upon maintaining connection to influences that support rather than corrupt natural life. The silence that surrounds their passage carries weight that presses against consciousness with the accumulated absence of sounds that should provide the constant background chorus of healthy countryside. Even insects seem to have fled from air that carries traces of presences inimical to all forms of life. Sam's growing exhaustion manifests in stumbles that become more frequent despite his determination to maintain pace, with companions whose longer strides should leave him struggling to keep contact. His breathing grows labored while his face shows the particular strain that comes from pushing physical capabilities beyond sustainable limits. Yet his loyalty provides strength that training could never supply. His commitment never wavers despite mounting evidence that their situation continues to deteriorate with each mile they cover. Merry and Pippin's youth serves them well during hours that test resilience in ways their comfortable upbringing never anticipated. Their bodies adapt to demands that seemed impossible during peaceful days, when greatest challenges involve social visits requiring lengthy walks between neighboring villages. Their hands develop blisters that split and bleed. Their legs protest against continued exertion that exceeds anything their previous experience prepared them to endure. Still, their determination holds firm against mathematical improbability. Frodo's condition provides the only source of encouragement. In circumstances that otherwise offer little foundation for hope, the Athelas continues its work of slowing the Morgul blade's corruption. His color improves, while his breathing adopts rhythms closer to normal patterns. His consciousness remains clear, despite the supernatural influences seeking to claim his spirit for purposes that serve darkness rather than healing. The temporary respite allows him to contribute to their flight, rather than remaining passive burden. The signs of pursuit grow more pronounced with each landmark they pass. Disturbed vegetation marks places where their enemies paused to examine evidence of their quarry's route. Broken branches speak of passage by creatures whose size and weight exceed normal limitations. The particular way stones have been displaced suggests searchers who possess senses capable of detecting traces invisible to ordinary perception, while following trails that conventional tracking could never reveal. Strider's assessment of their remaining time becomes increasingly grim as he interprets evidence that demonstrates their enemies' growing confidence in the success of their hunt. The Black Riders no longer attempt to conceal their own passage. Their route follows direct lines that speak of certainty about their quarry's destination. The calculated precision of their approach suggests knowledge that extends beyond simple tracking to encompass understanding of geography, and timing that leaves little room for escape through deception. The terrain ahead offers few opportunities for the kind of concealment that has allowed them to maintain their precarious advantage during the initial stages of their flight. Open country stretches toward horizons that provide clear visibility across distances measured in miles rather than yards. The broken ground that served them well near Weathertop gives way to rolling hills, whose gentle slopes offer no hiding places for travelers, whose presence would be visible to any eyes scanning from elevated positions. Weather patterns work against them, as clearing skies eliminate the cloud cover that had provided some protection against observation from above. Stars emerge with crystalline clarity that illuminates the countryside, with light sufficient for supernatural senses to detect movement across vast expanses. The wind that had helped mask sounds of their passage dies away to leave air still enough to carry whispers across distances that should render such communication impossible. The villages they must avoid in their flight toward Rivendell represent not just obstacles to direct travel, but potential sources of information for enemies whose methods encompass techniques that ordinary minds cannot comprehend. The Black Rider's ability to extract knowledge from unwilling subjects means that any contact with mortal inhabitants could provide their pursuers with intelligence about routes and timing that would eliminate the last advantages available to those seeking to reach sanctuary before corruption claims its victim. Food becomes increasingly scarce as their route forces them away from areas where supplies might be replenished through contact with friendly inhabitants. The provisions they carry dwindle according to schedules that may not allow for completion of their journey without accepting risks that could prove as fatal as the injuries they seek to heal. Hunger adds its voice to fatigue in a chorus of physical complaints that threaten to undermine their coordination precisely when such precision becomes essential. The mathematical reality of their situation grows clearer with each calculation that measures distance remaining against time available and resources on hand. The sound that reaches their ears through the pre-dawn darkness strikes terror into hearts already strained beyond normal endurance. Hoofbeats approach from the direction of their enemy's pursuit, with rhythms that speak of supernatural mounts covering ground at speeds no mortal horse could sustain. The measured cadence suggests riders who possess absolute confidence in their ability to overtake quarry, whose flight has finally reached its predetermined conclusion. Strider's hand moves to his sword with movements that speak of preparation for final stand rather than tactical repositioning. His assessment of their position reveals advantages that exist only in comparison to complete exposure. The rocky outcrop that provides their current shelter offers some protection against direct assault, yet its limited size means that determined attackers could overwhelm such defenses through persistence rather than superior numbers. Sam's protective instincts drive him to positions that place his body between approaching danger and the wounded friend, whose condition prevents any possibility of rapid flight. His hands grip weapons for which his gardening experience provides no preparation. His determination supplies courage that training could never deliver. The mathematical impossibility of their situation becomes irrelevant when measured against loyalty that transcends rational calculation of survival odds. The hoofbeats grow louder with each passing moment. Their steady approach eliminates any possibility that the sounds represent chance encounter with travelers whose purposes might align with their own desperate needs. The precision of the route being followed suggests pursuers who possess exact knowledge of their quarry's location. The confidence implicit in such direct approach speaks of hunters who consider capture inevitable rather than merely probable. Frodo's awareness of the approaching confrontation manifests in renewed struggle against the ring's influence. The golden circle seems to pulse with anticipation of reunion with forces that serve its master's will. His consciousness wavers between determination to resist and growing weakness that makes such resistance increasingly difficult to maintain. The Morgul wound's poison works to undermine his ability to choose concealment over the surrender that would end their flight. Merry and Pippin position themselves according to Strider's whispered instructions. Their young faces show understanding that courage alone cannot bridge the gap between their capabilities and the supernatural forces approaching through darkness that seems to thicken around their small refuge. Yet their commitment never falters despite clear awareness that morning might not find them among the living. The rider who emerges from the pre-dawn gloom carries with him presence that transforms the very quality of air around their hiding place. Light seems to gather around his figure without visible source. The oppressive weight that has pressed down upon their spirits since leaving Weathertop begins to lift like fog dispersing before strong wind. His mount moves with grace that speaks of noble breeding, rather than the unnatural coordination that marks creatures serving darker purposes. Glorfinal's voice when he speaks carries authority that penetrates through exhaustion and fear to reach places where hope had begun to wither under constant pressure from enemies whose persistence exceeded mortal understanding. His words bring immediate recognition that salvation has arrived in their darkest hour. The Elf Lord's presence creates sanctuary where none had existed moments before. Strider's relief at encountering this particular ally reveals knowledge of capabilities that extend far beyond simple combat prowess. His immediate transition from defensive preparation to arrangements for continued flight, demonstrates understanding that their situation has fundamentally changed. The mathematical impossibility that had governed their circumstances dissolves in the face of resources that operate outside normal limitations. Glorfindel's assessment of Frodo's condition encompasses both the visible effects of the Morgul wound and the deeper corruption that threatens to claim more than mere physical health. His examination reveals knowledge of such injuries that surpasses even Strider's considerable expertise. The treatments he provides supplement rather than replace the Athelis' work, while addressing aspects of the poisoning that field medicine cannot reach. The arrangements for transferring their wounded companion to swifter transport proceed with efficiency that speaks of experience, with similar rescues conducted under circumstances where delay means the difference between salvation and loss beyond any possibility of recovery. His horse accepts its new burden with intelligence that suggests understanding of the urgency that drives every decision being made. The renewed pace their unexpected ally makes possible transforms their desperate flight into something approaching organized retreat. The ground that had seemed to stretch endlessly toward impossibly distant sanctuary now passes beneath them with speed that makes their destination achievable rather than merely theoretical. Hope replaces despair as the primary emotion driving their continued effort. Glorfindel's knowledge of their enemies encompasses understanding that allows him to predict and counter the Black Rider's tactics. His route selection avoids areas where ambush becomes possible while maintaining progress toward Rivendell at speeds that exceed their pursuers' ability to intercept. The supernatural advantages that had made capture seem inevitable now work against enemies who find their quarry protected by forces they cannot easily overcome. The landscape itself seems to respond to the Elf Lord's presence by becoming more hospitable to their passage. Paths that had been treacherous smooth beneath their feet. Streams run clearer while providing water that tastes of growing things rather than metallic contamination. The very air carries sense of healthy countryside rather than the oppressive staleness that had marked territory claimed by influences hostile to natural life. The distance remaining to Rivendell's borders shrinks with each mile covered under protection that transforms impossible odds into manageable challenges that can be met through determination rather than mere hope for miraculous intervention. The urgency that drives their final approach toward Rivendell's protective borders stems from changes in Frodo's condition that become apparent despite the enhanced speed their unexpected ally has made possible. His consciousness beginning to drift between the world of ordinary perception and realms where the Morgul Blade's influence creates connections to powers that seek to claim him before sanctuary can be achieved. The temporary improvement that followed Strider's treatment with Aethelus proves insufficient against corruption that operates according to timelines established by forces beyond mortal understanding. Glorfindel's mount responds to supernatural need with capabilities that transcend normal equine limitations, its hooves finding purchase on terrain that should challenge. Careful navigation while maintaining speeds that blur the landscape into impressions of color and movement, rather than distinct features that can be individually identified. The countryside streams past them like water flowing round stones, hills and valleys merging into continuous motion that speaks of distance covered with efficiency that defies conventional understanding of travel across such varied terrain. The Elf Lord's awareness of their narrowing window for successful intervention manifests in adjustments to their route that prioritize directness over concealment, his calculations weighing the risks of exposure against the certainty of failure. If they cannot reach Rivendell's healing halls before the poison completes its work of transformation, his knowledge of the specific timeline they have a key allows him to measure each landmark against the progress of corruption that proceeds regardless of their speed or determination. Frodo's grip on the world of normal sensation weakens with each mile that passes beneath them, his consciousness slipping intermittently into twilight realms where the boundaries between physical reality and spiritual experience become meaningless distinctions that offer no foundation for maintaining connection to purposes that require continued resistance. The ring's weight against his chest seems to increase beyond what mere gold should possess, its presence demanding attention that draws awareness why from the urgent need to hold fast to his identity. The landscape itself bears witness to their desperate race, through changes that speak of proximity to influences that have claimed dominion over territory, through which their enemies have passed in pursuit of objectives that extend beyond simple capture to encompass transformation that would serve purposes hostile to all free will. Trees that should flourish in the rich soil of river valleys show signs of premature aging, their leaves displaying colors that belong to autumn despite the season's inappropriate timing. Streams that had run clear during their earlier passage now carry traces of contamination that make drinking an act requiring conscious effort to overcome instinctive revulsion, the water itself seeming to recoil from contact with vessels that have been touched by influences operating outside the normal boundaries of natural law. The air carries scents that belong to sealed places where healthy things cannot survive extended exposure to atmospheres designed for different forms of existence. Glorfindel's horse demonstrates understanding of their mission that goes beyond simple obedience to its rider's commands, its movements showing awareness of the urgency that drives every decision, while maintaining the smooth gait necessary to avoid aggravating injuries that exist as much in spiritual realms as physical ones. The animal's intelligence encompasses recognition of the supernatural forces at work and the particular care required when bearing passengers whose condition makes them vulnerable to influences that ordinary creatures never encounter. The signs of pursuit that marked their earlier flight disappear entirely as their increased speed carries them beyond the range, where such evidence could be detected by normal methods of observation. Yet the sense of being hunted continues to press against their consciousness, with weight that speaks of enemies whose tracking abilities operate through channels that distance alone cannot disrupt. The Black Rider's presence makes itself known through changes in atmospheric pressure and temperature that have nothing to do with weather patterns. Time becomes enemy as potent as any physical threat they have faced. Each moment that passes measuring progress, not just toward their destination, but through stages of corruption that will reach completion, regardless of whether they achieve sanctuary in Rivendell's halls of healing. The mathematics of their situation allow for no margin of error, no delays that might be recovered through greater effort applied later in their journey. The river sounds that begin to penetrate through the constant rhythm of hoofbeats on stone and earth carry promise of approaching salvation. the voice of water that flows from sources uncorrupted by the influences that have poisoned so much of the countryside through which they have passed. The Bruinen song speaks of connections to powers that serve healing rather than corruption, its current carrying away contamination, rather than concentrating it in stagnant pools where unwholesome things can flourish. Frodo's awareness of their approaching destination flickers like candle flame in wind that threatens to extinguish the last spark of consciousness that maintains his connection to purposes that require continued resistance against forces seeking to claim him for service that would violate everything he has ever valued. The particular quality of light that begins to gather around them speaks of proximity to realms where different laws apply to the relationship between matter and spirit. The ford itself becomes visible through trees, that part like curtains drawn aside to reveal the stage, where the final act of their desperate flight must be performed. The shallow crossing that represents the boundary between territory claimed by enemies whose persistence has brought them to the very threshold of success, and a sanctuary that promises healing for those who can reach its protective embrace before corruption completes its systematic destruction of everything that makes resistance possible. The hoofbeats that follow them through the morning air carry rhythms that speak of supernatural mounts, whose endurance exceeds normal limitations, their approach timed with precision that suggests coordination between hunters who have finally maneuvered their quarry into position, where capture becomes inevitable rather than merely probable. The moment of confrontation approaches with mathematical certainty, as the distance between pursued and pursuers narrows to measurements that can be covered in minutes rather than hours. The shallow waters of the Bruinen stretch before them, like silver ribbon marking the boundary between realms, where different authorities hold sway, its gentle current carrying away the contamination that has poisoned so much of the countryside, while speaking in voices that remember times when such cleansing was unnecessary, because corruption had not yet learned to seep into places where wholesome things were meant to flourish. The ford itself appears deceptively peaceful, its stones worn smooth by centuries of honest traffic between settlements, whose inhabitants travelled in safety rather than desperation. Glorfindel's mount plunges into the stream without hesitation, its hooves sending spray that catches morning light in patterns that seem to celebrate their approach to sanctuary that has remained beyond reach. Through days of flight across territory increasingly hostile to their continued existence, the water rises around them with temperature that speaks of sources high in mountains where snow feeds currents that have never known the touch of influences that corrupt, rather than sustain the natural processes that govern healthy landscapes. The Black Riders emerge from concealment among trees that seem to wither at their approach. 9 figures whose presence transforms the peaceful riverside into an arena where forces, representing opposing principles of existence, must finally resolve conflicts that have shaped the pursuit across miles of increasingly hostile country. Their mounts move with coordination that speaks of shared consciousness rather than individual decision, unity that transcends any cooperation achievable through mere discipline or training. Frodo's awareness sharpens to crystalline clarity as proximity to both salvation and ultimate danger burns away the fog that has clouded his thoughts since receiving the Morgul wound, his consciousness emerging from twilight realms to focus upon choices that will determine not just his personal fate, but the success or failure of purposes that extend far beyond individual survival. The ring's weight against his chest becomes unbearable, as conflicting forces reach maximum intensity in their struggle for dominion over his spirit. The water that swirls around Glorfindel's horse creates barrier that the black riders approach with obvious reluctance, their forms wavering at the stream's edge as if the flowing current possesses properties that interfere with their ability to maintain coherent existence in the realm of normal perception. The Bruinen's song grows louder as more of its length comes between pursued and pursuers, its voice carrying notes that seem to strengthen with each moment that passes. The Witch King's commands ring across the water, with authority that bypasses rational thought to attack the primitive centers of consciousness that governs survival responses, his words carrying power that seeks to override free will through direct assault upon the foundations of individual identity. The terror that radiates from his presence strikes even protected minds with force that threatens to paralyze muscles while accelerating heartbeats beyond sustainable rhythms. Frodo's struggle against the compulsion to surrender becomes visible in movements that speak of internal warfare being waged on battlefields, where the outcome will determine whether his spirit serves light or darkness for whatever existence remains available to consciousness that survives such transformation. His hands shake with effort required to maintain control over actions that feel increasingly directed by will other than his own. The horses that bear the Black Riders demonstrate supernatural coordination as they enter the ford despite obvious distress caused by contact with water that carries influences hostile to their continued existence, their forms becoming translucent while their riders maintain solid appearance. That speaks of power sufficient to overcome obstacles that would stop lesser servants of darkness. Steam rises from points where their hooves touch the stream, evidence of fundamental incompatibility between their nature and the current that flows from sources dedicated to healing rather than corruption. The crossing proceeds with agonizing slowness, as each step forward requires conscious effort to overcome resistance that grows stronger with proximity to the opposite bank, where sanctuary awaits those who can complete the journey before forces seeking to prevent such achievement overwhelm their remaining capacity for independent action. The mathematical precision of timing becomes apparent as distance and endurance reach perfect balance that allows for no margin of error. Glorfindel's presence creates a zone of protection that extends beyond his immediate vicinity to encompass passengers whose condition makes them vulnerable to influences that would claim them for purposes serving destruction rather than preservation of free will, his power manifesting not through dramatic displays, but through steady resistance that maintains space where choice remains possible, despite overwhelming pressure to surrender. The Bruinen itself begins to respond to the supernatural conflict taking place within its bounds. Current quickening while water level rises beyond what seasonal conditions should permit. The stream awakening to awareness of its role in conflict soul that will determine whether healing or corruption gains dominion over territory that has remained neutral in struggles between forces whose opposition predates the memory of mortal races. The moment when safety becomes achievable, rather than merely theoretical, arrives with suddenness that transforms desperation into hope, the opposite bank rising before them with promise of ground that has never known the touch of influences hostile to natural law, while offering foundation solid enough to support those whose flight has carried them beyond endurance, yet somehow delivered them to a threshold of sanctuary. the Black Rider's final attempt to prevent their quarry's escape manifests in coordinated assault that seeks to overwhelm protective barriers through simultaneous application of power that has accumulated during their long pursuit. 9 wills focused upon single objective with intensity that threatens to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself, while demanding surrender that would end resistance once and forever. The water around them begins to glow with light that has no visible source, yet penetrates through darkness, that seeks to claim dominion over surfaces where reflection should reveal only sky and clouds. The stream itself becoming conduit for forces that serve purposes aligned with healing rather than the corruption that spreads outward from sources whose influence corrupts everything they touch. The ford trembles beneath conflicting pressures as powers that operate according to different principles struggle for dominion over territory, whose ownership will determine whether sanctuary remains achievable or becomes another illusion shattered by realities too harsh for hope to survive intact. The power that awakens in the Bruinen's waters announces itself through changes that transform gentle current into force capable of reshaping the very landscape through which it flows. The stream begins to rise with speed that defies natural explanation. Its voice grows from whisper to roar as volume increases beyond what any seasonal conditions could produce. Elrond's will reaches across the distance that separates Rivendell from the ford. His influence transforms ordinary water into weapon, specifically designed to cleanse territory contaminated by presences that corrupt rather than heal. The river responds to commands that operate through channels connecting all things that serve purposes, aligned with preservation rather than destruction. White horses begin to form within the rising current. These are not mere foam created by turbulent water striking stone. They possess substance, an intention that speaks of elemental forces given temporary form to serve specific objectives. In conflicts where normal weapons prove inadequate against enemies who exist partially outside the boundaries of physical law. The Black Riders' mounts panic as water rises around them with supernatural speed. Their supernatural coordination breaks down under assault from forces they cannot resist or comprehend. The unity that made them unstoppable hunters dissolves into individual struggles for survival, against current that seeks to carry away contamination wherever it encounters such corruption. The Witch King's commands ring across the flood with desperation that replaces the absolute confidence he displayed during their long pursuit. His authority proves meaningless when exercised against powers that serve masters whose purposes predate his own allegiance to darkness. The terror that radiates from his presence begins to turn inward as he faces forces beyond his ability to control. Frodo watches from Glorfindel's horse as waters rise to engulf their enemies with efficiency that speaks of justice rather than mere tactical advantage. The white horses surge forward with purpose that encompasses both protection of sanctuaries, borders, and cleansing of territory that has been contaminated by extended exposure to influences hostile to natural law. The roar of the flood drowns out all other sounds as the Bruinen demonstrates its power to protect approaches to Rivendell from any force that seeks to bring corruption within reach of those who have sought sanctuary within its borders. The current carries away not just physical forms, but the very essence of contamination that had begun to seep into surrounding landscape. the Black Riders disappear beneath waters that show no mercy to creatures whose existence depends upon maintaining connections to realms where darkness holds dominion over light. Their forms dissolve like shadows exposed to sunshine too bright for such manifestations to maintain coherence in the presence of forces specifically designed to eliminate their influence. The horses of foam surge past Glorfindel's position with movements that create space where safety becomes absolute rather than merely probable. Their passage leaves behind water that runs clear and clean. The metallic taste that had contaminated the stream during their enemy's approach vanishes completely as purification eliminates all traces of supernatural corruption. Silence returns to the ford as suddenly as chaos had erupted from depths, where elemental powers waited for commands from those whose authority encompasses dominion over natural forces. The Bruinen settles back into normal patterns of flow and depth. Its voice returns to gentle murmur that speaks of peaceful purposes, rather than the righteous anger that had transformed it into instrument of divine justice. The opposite bank rises before them, solid and real. Ground that has never known contamination offers foundation that can support those whose flight has finally reached its predetermined destination. Safety transforms from distant hope into immediate reality, as Glorfindel's mount carries them beyond the reach of any pursuit. The air itself feels different on the Rivendell side of the crossing. It carries scents of growing things and clean earth, rather than the oppressive staleness that had marked territory claimed by influences hostile to life. Breathing becomes pleasure rather than necessity as lungs fill with atmosphere designed to sustain, rather than burden those who dwell within its embrace. Trees that grow along the riverbank show health that contrasts sharply with the withered vegetation they have passed during their flight. Leaves display colors appropriate to the season, while branches reach toward sky with confidence that speaks of soil that nourishes rather than poisons roots that seek sustenance from depths, where wholesome things are meant to flourish. Birds return to fill the air with songs that celebrate the cleansing that has restored natural balance to territory that serves as approach to sanctuary, where healing arts are practiced by those whose knowledge encompasses treatments effective against even supernatural corruption. Their voices create symphony that speaks of life triumphant over forces that sought to claim dominion through destruction rather than creation. The mathematical impossibility that had governed their circumstances throughout the desperate flight dissolves in the face of powers that operate according to principles beyond normal understanding, yet serve purposes that align with hopes rather than fears of those who seek protection from enemies, whose persistence had seemed to make capture inevitable rather than merely probable. The moment when safety should have brought relief instead triggers the final assault from poison that has been gathering strength. During every mile of their desperate flight toward sanctuary, Frodo's consciousness, which had maintained precarious hold on the world of normal perception through sheer determination, begins to slip away as if the achievement of their destination has somehow given the Morgul Blade's corruption permission to complete its terrible work. His grip on Glorfindel's horse loosens without warning. The strength that had sustained him through impossible trials simply vanishes, like candle flame extinguished by wind too strong for any wick to resist. The colors that had returned to his features during Strider's treatment drain away with alarming speed. His skin takes on the translucent quality that speaks of barriers between worlds becoming dangerously thin. Sam's cry of alarm cuts through the peaceful air surrounding their sanctuary, with raw terror that transforms triumph into renewed nightmare. His hands reach out to steady his master, but find only dead weight that responds to touch, without any sign of awareness or recognition. The eyes that had shown such courage during their long ordeal now stare at nothing, while pupils contract to pinpoints that fail to respond to changing light. The breathing that becomes shallow and irregular suggests systemic failure that goes beyond simple exhaustion, or even the effects of supernatural poisoning as normally understood. Each breath seems to require conscious effort that grows more difficult with every attempt. The spaces between inhalation and exhalation stretch longer, as if his body is forgetting the automatic processes that sustain life in creatures meant for mortal existence. Glorfindel's immediate response reveals knowledge of such crises gained through experience with similar cases where victory and defeat balance on edges sharper than any blade forged by mortal hands. His examination of the collapsed hobbit proceeds with efficiency that speaks of understanding exactly what forces are at work, and how little time remains for intervention to prove effective against corruption this advanced. Merry and Pippin crowd around their fallen friend with faces that show the particular horror that comes from watching someone they love slip beyond the reach of any comfort or assistance they can provide. Their voices calling his name carry desperation that echoes across water, still celebrating its recent victory over enemies, whose defeat now seems meaningless in the face of loss that threatens to make their entire struggle pointless. The pulse that Glorfindel finds beneath his fingertips tells stories that require no medical training to interpret with growing alarm. The rhythm that should beat steady and strong instead flutters like bird trapped in cage too small for survival. Each heartbeat seems weaker than the last, while intervals between them stretch into silences that might not end. Strider's arrival at their position brings additional expertise to bear on crisis that may have moved beyond the reach of any mortal knowledge to address effectively. His examination confirms what Glorfindel's more sensitive perception has already detected. The Morgul blade's poison has reached the final stages of its progression. Through systems designed for life rather than the twilight existence that represents compromise between death and service to darkness. The urgency that drives their immediate preparations for transport to Rivendell's halls of healing reflects understanding that minutes now matter in ways that hours had. During their long flight from Weathertop's cursed summit, every moment of delay increases the likelihood that their friend will slip beyond the reach of even elven medicine, to follow paths that lead toward realms where different laws apply to consciousness and identity. The horse that Glorfindel summons from depths of need rather than normal calling responds with intelligence that encompasses both the nature of their emergency and the particular care required when bearing passengers whose condition places them at the very threshold between worlds. Its movements adopt rhythms designed to avoid any jarring that might accelerate processes already threatening to claim their victim for purposes that serve corruption rather than healing. The landscape that flows past them during their final approach to Sanctuary carries none of the menace that had marked their journey through territory contaminated by supernatural influence. Trees reach towards sky with confidence, while streams run clear and sweet. Yet these signs of health and natural beauty feel irrelevant when measured against the possibility that their friend might never again possess consciousness capable of appreciating such gifts. The walls of Rivendell rise before them, like promise of sanctuary that may have come too late to matter for the one whose need had driven their desperate flight across country, where every landmark measured progress not just towards safety, but through stages of corruption that proceed according to schedules established by forces beyond mortal power to influence or delay. The healers who emerge to meet their arrival move with practiced efficiency that speaks of readiness for exactly such emergencies. Their hands reach for the unconscious hobbit with movements that waste no motion while their eyes assess damage that exists as much in spiritual realms as physical ones. The moment when responsibility transfers from those who brought him to safety to those whose knowledge might yet prove sufficient to restore. What corruption has sought to claim arrives with weight that encompasses both relief and renewed fear about outcomes that remain balanced on edges too fine for prediction. The return to consciousness arrives not as sudden awakening, but as gradual emergence from depths where awareness had been suspended, in twilight realms between sleep and something far more dangerous than ordinary rest. Frodo's first sensation involves the quality of light that filters through his closed eyelids, gentle radiance that speaks of morning sunlight, rather than the harsh illumination that had burned through his fevered dreams during the darkest hours of his struggle against corruption. The sounds that penetrate his slowly clearing mind-mend carry none of the urgency or terror that had marked every moment of his recent existence. Water moves with peaceful murmur over stones worn smooth by centuries of patient flow. Birds offer songs that celebrate dawn, rather than warn of approaching danger. Voices speak in tones that suggest conversation, rather than desperate planning or hurried consultation about crises that demand immediate attention. His body responds to attempts at movement with weakness that feels natural rather than the supernatural lethargy that had threatened to claim his spirit for purposes serving darkness rather than healing. Muscles protest against exertion while remaining connected to conscious will, in ways that had been compromised during his worst moments under the Morgul Blade's influence. The simple act of flexing his fingers brings satisfaction that speaks of control restored to systems that had been slipping beyond his ability to direct. The bed beneath him offers comfort that transcends mere physical support to encompass psychological reassurance, that he rests in place dedicated to healing rather than the makeshift arrangements that had marked their desperate flight across country, increasingly hostile to their continued survival. Clean sheets carry scents of lavender and other herbs that speak of domestic tranquility, rather than the wild plants that had provided their only medicine during days when survival depended upon constant vigilance. Memory returns in fragments that reassemble themselves into understanding of how completely his circumstances have changed since the moment when consciousness abandoned him at the very threshold of sanctuary. The terror that had driven every decision during their flight feels distant as nightmare that loses power when exposed to daylight, that reveals ordinary surroundings where such fears cannot maintain their hold over rational thought. The air he breathes carries qualities that make each inhalation a pleasure, rather than necessity grudgingly satisfied by lungs that had struggled against atmosphere contaminated by influences hostile to natural life. Oxygen flows through his system with efficiency that suggests complete restoration of processes that had been compromised by poison designed to transform, rather than simply destroy its victims. The metallic taste that had contaminated every breath during his illness has vanished entirely. His eyes open to reveal chamber, whose proportions speak of architectural traditions that prioritize harmony over mere functionality. Walls that rise with grace, while windows frame views of gardens where growing things flourish under care. That encompasses both practical knowledge and aesthetic understanding. The ceiling above displays craftsmanship that transforms necessary structure into art that pleases without demanding attention from minds that seek rest rather than stimulation. Books rest on shelves within easy reach, while their presence suggests resources available to those whose recovery might benefit from gentle mental exercise rather than the complete inactivity that some injuries require for proper healing. The volumes display bindings that speak of care in preservation, while their topics encompass subjects that nourish rather than burden consciousness, seeking to restore connections to learning and beauty that illness had temporarily severed. A pitcher of water stands beside his bed, while crystal clarity of the liquid within suggests sources that have never known contamination by influences that corrupt rather than sustain natural processes. The cup that waits nearby shows craftsmanship that elevates simple utility into objects worthy of appreciation for their own sake, rather than mere tools that serve basic needs without consideration for the pleasure that well-made things can provide. The clothes that have replaced his travel-stained garments carry textures that speak of materials chosen for comfort, rather than durability against conditions that test every thread and seem beyond normal limits of endurance. Clean fabric rests against skin that shows no trace of the corruption that had threatened to claim his flesh along with his spirit, for purposes that would have violated everything he valued about his identity and connections to those he loved. Sunlight that streams through windows reveals gardens where paths wind between flower beds, tended with knowledge that encompasses both the practical requirements of growing things, an understanding of how beauty affects minds that encounter it during moments when healing proceeds through appreciation, rather than mere medical intervention. The colors that dance in gentle breeze speak of seasons that turn according to natural rhythms, rather than the supernatural influences that had disrupted normal patterns. The silence that surrounds his awakening carries weight of peace, rather than the oppressive quality that had marked their journey through territory claimed by forces hostile to life and free will. This quiet speaks of sanctuary where rest becomes possible without the constant vigilance that had been necessary for survival in places where enemies possessed advantages that made concealment temporary rather than reliable protection against detection. The realization that he has survived what should have proved fatal strikes him with wonder that encompasses not just gratitude for his own preservation, but amazement that powers exist which can restore what seemed lost beyond any possibility of recovery. The mathematical impossibility that had governed their circumstances throughout their flight has been overcome by forces that operate according to principles beyond normal understanding, yet serve purposes aligned with hope rather than despair. The door to his chamber stands open to admit breezes that carry scents of growing things and clean earth rather than the staleness that had marked air contaminated by influences that drain life from everything they touch. Through that opening, he can glimpse corridors that stretch toward other parts of this sanctuary, where different forms of healing address wounds that affect body, mind, and spirit through methods that encompass far more than simple medicine. The figure who enters his chamber moves with grace that speaks of centuries devoted to understanding how knowledge can serve healing, rather than the accumulation of power for its own sake. Elrond's presence brings immediate sense of safety that penetrates deeper than mere physical comfort to reach places where fear had taken root during days when survival balanced on edges too sharp for prediction. His eyes carry wisdom that encompasses both the specific nature of the injury that had threatened to claim another victim, and the broader implications of forces that seek to corrupt rather than destroy. His examination proceeds with hands that have learned to read stories written in flesh and spirit by influences that operate beyond the reach of conventional medicine. Each touch reveals information about the progress of healing, while assessing damage that exists in realms where physical sensation becomes indistinguishable from spiritual experience. The knowledge that guides his movements encompasses traditions passed down through ages when such wounds were common, rather than rare encounters with supernatural malice. The explanation that emerges from his assessment paints pictures of corruption that had advanced further than even Strider's considerable expertise had recognized. During their desperate flight toward sanctuary, the Morgul Blade's poison had begun the systematic transformation of systems, designed for life into something that could serve purposes aligned with darkness, rather than the free will that defines creatures meant for mortal existence, rather than twilight states between death and enslavement. Frodo's understanding of how close he had come to losing not just life, but identity itself arrives with clarity that makes his survival seem impossible rather than merely improbable. The timeline that governed his corruption had allowed for intervention only during narrow windows when healing remained achievable through methods that required resources unavailable anywhere except sanctuaries, like Rivendell, where ancient knowledge still guides the practice of arts that address wounds affecting more than flesh and bone. The treatments that had restored him encompass techniques that blend physical medicine with approaches that engage forces operating in realms where thought and matter interact according to principles beyond normal understanding. Herbs gathered from gardens where growing things flourish under influences that enhance rather than merely sustain their natural properties. Waters drawn from springs that have never known contamination by forces that corrupt rather than cleanse whatever they touch. Songs that carry healing power through melodies that resonate with frequencies capable of restoring harmony to systems disrupted by influences, designed to create discord rather than the balance necessary for healthy function. The voices that had sung such music during his unconscious hours created patterns of sound that penetrated through barriers erected by poison to reach places where corruption sought to establish permanent foothold in consciousness meant to remain free. The gradual process of restoration had required constant attention from healers, whose knowledge encompasses understanding of how supernatural wounds respond to treatments that address their spiritual components rather than merely attempting to repair physical damage that represents only the visible portion of injuries that exist primarily in realms where different laws apply to the relationship between will and substance. His body shows evidence of the struggle that had taken place while awareness remained suspended in depths. where healing and corruption competed for dominion over systems caught between opposing forces. Scars that will fade but never disappear entirely mark places where the Morgul blade's influence had penetrated deepest before being driven back by treatments that encompassed far more than simple application of medicine to affected areas. The particular weakness that remains serves as a reminder of how completely ordinary defenses prove inadequate against enemies whose weapons operate through channels that bypass conventional protections to attack directly the foundations of identity and free will. Recovery will require time measured in weeks rather than days, while strength returns according to schedules that cannot be hurried through determination alone. Elrond's knowledge extends beyond the immediate requirements of physical healing to encompass understanding of psychological restoration necessary for complete recovery from experiences that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the effectiveness of courage against forces that seem to make such qualities irrelevant. His questions probe gently into areas where trauma might have taken root during hours, when consciousness existed partially outside normal boundaries. The medicines that continue his treatment include preparations that address not just lingering effects of supernatural poisoning, but the broader impacts of exposure to influences that corrupt through contact, rather than requiring direct assault upon their victims. These remedies work to strengthen natural defenses while restoring systems that had been compromised by proximity to forces that drain vitality from everything they encounter. Sleep that comes naturally rather than as escape from consciousness too burdened to remain alert brings dreams that carry healing rather than the nightmares that had marked his darkest hours under the Morgul blade's influence. Rest becomes restorative rather than mere suspension of awareness, while recovery proceeds according to rhythms that align with natural cycles rather than the artificial timelines imposed by enemies whose patience operates outside normal limitations. Food prepared in kitchens where ingredients receive blessing along with careful preparation provides nourishment that addresses more than simple physical needs. Each meal carries flavors that speak of earth that has never known contamination, while preparation methods enhance rather than diminish the life-giving properties that sustain creatures meant for mortality, rather than the compromised existence that serves as alternative to death when corruption claims its victims. The gardens visible from his window display evidence of knowledge that encompasses both practical understanding of what growing things require for healthy development and appreciation for how beauty affects minds that encounter it during moments when healing proceeds through contact with influences that create rather than destroy. Paths wind between beds where flowers bloom according to seasons that follow natural rather than supernatural schedules. Water that flows through channels carved with attention to both function and aesthetics carries away whatever contamination might threaten to accumulate in places where many come seeking restoration from injuries that encompass far more than physical trauma. The sound it makes speaks of purposes that serve cleansing rather than the stagnation that allows unwholesome influences to concentrate in areas where they can affect those whose condition makes them vulnerable. Books that rest within easy reach contain knowledge that nourishes without overwhelming minds that seek gentle stimulation, rather than challenges that might prove too demanding for consciousness still recovering from experiences that had tested its ability to maintain connection to purposes that require continued resistance against forces seeking to claim it for service to corruption rather than freely chosen objectives. The understanding that he rests in place where such complete healing becomes possible, rather than merely theoretical, brings gratitude. That encompasses recognition of how rarely such sanctuary exists in world, where forces that serve destruction rather than creation hold dominion over vast territories, where hope itself becomes luxury that few can afford to maintain. The voices that reach him through corridors leading to his chamber carry familiar tones that speak of friends whose loyalty had sustained them through trials, that should have destroyed any bonds less deeply rooted in genuine affection. Sam's approach announces itself through footsteps that quicken with each yard covered toward the room where his master rests in safety that it seemed impossible to achieve during their darkest hours on the road from Weathertop's cursed summit. The door opens to admit faces that show relief beyond any expression that words could adequately convey. Sam's weathered features display the particular joy that comes from witnessing recovery that defies every expectation formed during moments when hope seemed like luxury that circumstances could not afford. His eyes examine Frodo with attention that encompasses both gratitude for healing achieved and lingering concern about effects that might persist despite obvious improvement. Merry and Pippin crowd through the doorway with enthusiasm that transforms the peaceful chamber into celebration space, where laughter becomes medicine, more effective than any preparation that could be mixed in even the most skilled healer's workshop. Their voices carry stories of their own recovery from experiences that had tested courage beyond anything their comfortable upbringing had prepared them to endure, while maintaining optimism that proves more resilient than any armor forged by mortal hands. The reunion that unfolds around his bedside encompasses more than simple relief at survival achieved against overwhelming odds. Their shared experience of supernatural terror, followed by salvation that seemed impossible rather than merely improbable, creates bonds that transcend the comfortable friendships of their youth to encompass understanding that comes only through facing death together, while maintaining loyalty that makes such trials bearable rather than simply endurable. Sam's account of the hours that passed while consciousness remained suspended between healing and corruption paints pictures of vigil maintained by friends whose determination refused to accept that their companion might slip beyond recovery, despite evidence that suggested such optimism had no foundation in medical reality. His description of treatments applied by healers, whose knowledge encompassed techniques beyond his understanding, reveals appreciation for arts that serve purposes he cannot fully comprehend, yet recognizes as essential for restoration achieved. Merry's questions about his experience during the darkest moments of poisoning reflect curiosity tempered by understanding that some knowledge carries weight too heavy for casual sharing. His gentle probing seeks reassurance that healing has reached depths where corruption sought to establish permanent foothold rather than merely addressing symptoms visible to ordinary observation. The relief that shows in his features when answers confirm complete restoration speaks of fears that had been carefully concealed during uncertainty about outcomes. Pippin's natural enthusiasm finds expression in plans for activities that assume continued recovery rather than dwelling upon dangers that have been overcome through intervention that seemed miraculous when measured against the mathematical impossibility that had governed their circumstances throughout their flight toward sanctuary. His voice carries forward momentum that refuses to remain focused upon trials that belong to past rather than future, that stretches ahead with possibilities unmarked by supernatural threat. The arrival of Gandalf transforms their informal gathering into something approaching council, where explanations can be offered for events that had challenged understanding, while demanding responses that exceeded any preparation their peaceful upbringing had provided. For encounters with forces operating outside normal boundaries of natural law, his presence brings authority that encompasses both immediate comfort and broader perspective on conflicts that extend far beyond their personal experience of supernatural malice. His account of the Black Rider's nature and purpose reveals the specific reasons why their pursuit had been so relentless, while explaining how powers that serve healing rather than corruption had been able to provide protection that conventional defenses could never have supplied against enemies whose capabilities transcended normal limitations. The knowledge he shares encompasses both reassurance about safety achieved and warnings about challenges that may lie ahead. The stories that emerge from their collective experience create narrative that transforms individual suffering into shared triumph over forces that seek to divide conscious beings from one another through fear and desperation. Each voice adds details that complete pictures painted by others, while revealing how their separate ordeals had contributed to ultimate success that no single participant could have achieved through solitary effort. The deep peace that surrounds their reunion encompasses more than mere absence of immediate danger, to include positive presence of influences that actively support healing and restoration rather than simply providing neutral space where such processes might occur without interference. Rivendell's very atmosphere carries properties that enhance, rather than merely permit, the kinds of recovery that address wounds affecting spirit along with flesh. Food that arrives to mark their celebration provides nourishment that transcends simple sustenance to encompass flavors that speak of ingredients blessed by knowledge, that encompasses both practical understanding of nutrition and appreciation for how pleasure affects minds that have endured trials testing every assumption about the reliability of comfort and safety in a world where such qualities cannot be taken for granted. The understanding that settles over them as afternoon advances toward evening encompasses recognition that their arrival in Rivendell represents respite, rather than conclusion of responsibilities that extend beyond personal survival to encompass purposes that will require decisions about futures they had never imagined. When their journey began with simple departure from Shire's protected borders toward what they assumed would be conventional travel between familiar destinations, Gandalf's gentle references to councils that must be held and choices that await making create awareness that healing achieved through sanctuaries' protection serves to prepare them for challenges that will test everything they have learned about courage and loyalty, while demanding commitments that exceed anything their previous experience has required them to contemplate as realistic possibilities, rather than abstract concepts encountered in stories about other people's adventures. The peace that fills Rivendell's halls offers time for reflection and preparation, rather than permanent escape from world-where forces that serve corruption continue their work of claiming territory and consciousness for purposes that violate principles upon which free will depends for meaningful existence. Their rest here must serve to strengthen rather than soften resolve that will be needed for trials that make their recent ordeal seem like preparation rather than culmination of service to causes greater than individual comfort or survival. The evening that settles around them brings with it awareness that tomorrow will demand decisions that will shape not just their personal futures, but the fate of all who value freedom over the alternatives that serve those whose power grows through enslaving, rather than protecting the consciousness they encounter.